Hola amigos, ¿qué tal? Stu here from Spain Speaks with an update video today, a bit of a feedback video as we normally do after the news videos. We'll go through some of the comments, see what people were talking about, some of the main issues that were raised. I'll also give an update of what's going on here at the moment, especially in Madrid. As we know, Madrid started a type of lockdown last Friday, and of course today, Monday, the first working day with that lockdown in place. So it's going to be interesting to see how people are getting on in the capital city, going about their day-to-day, whether they're allowed to go to work, whether there are any police controls, what's going on in the capital city at the moment. One of the things we mentioned in yesterday's video is that a lot of people having trouble in the capital city to understand what's going on, people saying that the new rules and regulations are absurd. I think that was the key word that we took out of yesterday's video, absurd, absurdity. People don't really understand what's going on, why the politicians are doing what they are doing, why they are shutting down now the whole city, where before it was limited to health areas. For example, the health areas with the highest incidence rates were the ones that were closed down in previous weeks, and now they've extended it to the whole city. A lot of people can't understand why people in those higher incidence rate areas are now able to travel freely to other parts of the city, perhaps areas where there isn't such a high incidence rate. But I mentioned yesterday that it seems to be a light lockdown. If we compare it to the lockdown that we had in March, April, May, it is a lot lighter than that one. Of course, during that lockdown, you couldn't do anything. You weren't allowed to go outside except to go to the pharmacy, to the tobacco shop, which was very important, and also to go to the supermarket. You weren't even allowed to go outside for any type of exercise. But of course, now with this new lockdown, you have a lot more freedoms if you are living in one of these areas. For example, as I mentioned, you can go to work, you can go to school, you can go about your day-to-day, although you are recommended to cut back on your activity, cut back on the times that you leave home. And one of the main things they're cracking down on, of course, is nightlife by imposing that 10 p.m. curfew, or that 10 p.m. cutoff time when restaurants are allowed to serve food. So people have to be out of restaurants, out of bars, out of coffee shops at 11 p.m. So people in the capital city getting used to this new way of life. And I'm sure that during this week we'll get a better idea of what actually is going on in Madrid and whether the health situation gets under control. Because remember, that's the main objective that they have at the moment, to try to get those numbers down. Those increasing numbers, and especially in some of the areas in the south of the city, the working class neighborhoods, if you like, neighborhoods where people live in very cramped conditions. Often people live with various family members. I saw an interview in yesterday's paper with a family that lives in one of these high incidence rate areas, and I think it was a family of 5, but also the 2 grandparents were living there as well. So 7 people in a house of about 60 square meters in one of these southern neighborhoods in Madrid. So a lot of people find themselves in that type of situation where they're living in very cramped conditions, have to go to work every day because they work in cleaning, they work in restaurants, they work in a lot of these manual labor jobs, have to take the metro, have to take the bus. They might not have a car. Salaries, of course, not very high, and families living in, as I said, quite cramped conditions. And when you get on the metro here in Madrid and you go through those southern neighborhoods, for example, if you take the circular line which goes through areas like Carabanchel, for example, which is also a working class neighborhood, you can see just how busy the metro gets in that part of the world. No different to the London Underground or the Paris Metro, a very busy form of public transport. But the Madrid government said that they were going to put on more trains, more buses, but I don't think that that is happening because there's been cutbacks for the last 10 years with public transport in a city like Madrid. And that's one of the big problems in the country, those constant cutbacks over the last 10 years or so. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic is showing all of those cracks and exposing all of those cutbacks and where resources are lacking. Things like public transport, the hospital system, education, all of those key sectors have seen cutbacks over the last decade or so because the crisis here in 2008, 2009, it continued through to about 2014, was terrible for the Spanish economy. So that is where we are in Madrid at the moment. I don't know whether people are protesting. I saw that somebody said that people are taking to the streets, demonstrations, protesting against the new measures. I haven't seen much information about that. I saw it last week that people in places like Vallecas, one of the neighborhoods affected, were complaining, and the police went quite hard with those protesters, but I haven't seen anything in the last couple of days about whether people are hitting the streets protesting against the measures in Madrid. And of course, the Madrid Madrid government is waiting to see if they can overturn the central government's decision. So we'll wait and see also what happens with regard to that topic. Now, there were lots of comments about that curfew in Madrid, that 10 p.m. curfew when restaurants have to stop serving meals. People have to be out by 11 o'clock. And of course, restaurant owners are doubting whether people in Madrid will be able to adapt their schedules and have dinner earlier in the evening. Because as I said in yesterday's video, 10 p.m. is a fairly common time for people to go out and have dinner in a city like Madrid. In fact, it's fairly common around the whole country, especially at weekends. You'll see Spanish people having dinner very, very late. If you go to one of these tourist resorts, you'll always notice that there are different time slots for different groups of people. For example, British people normally have dinner quite early. Then you get other Europeans going in to have dinner around 8, around 9. And of course, the Spaniards are the last to show up, having dinner quite late. And it is something about this country that everything seems to happen late. I talked about this in a video a couple of years ago, how things in the morning seem to work normally. They seem to work on a normal European schedule, but it's around lunchtime when things start to get pushed back. Of course, lunch here in Spain isn't normally until around 2, sometimes 3, maybe even later at weekends. And of course, that pushes everything back. And a lot of people don't finish work. If they work in a company, they might not finish until 6:30 or 7 p.m. And by the time they get home, relax, do a few things, it's about 9 o'clock, then they decide to go out maybe around 9:30, 10 and have dinner. So I don't know if people are going to be able to adapt. So maybe those restaurant owners are right and they should be preparing for the worst possible scenario. So that's one of the problems with timetables and schedules in this country in general. A lot of people say that Spain is on the wrong time to begin with. It should be on Portuguese time or GMT. Apparently it was Franco back in the day who changed the time zone in Spain. He moved it on to the Central European time, I think, onto the German time to be more in line with Germany, and he thought that was going to help Spain at that particular time, and it never got changed back. So Spain technically should have the same time as Portugal or the UK, but we have the same time as France and Germany and those other European countries to the north. Now, there were also a few comments about the healthcare system here in Spain. I mentioned in yesterday's video that we have free healthcare in this country. That's not technically true. You pay for it through taxes and social security contributions. I, for example, being self-employed, I pay about 285 euros every month, and that gives me healthcare, and it also gives me access to a pension, hopefully in the future, those 285 euros. But what I meant yesterday when I said it was free is that there's no extra costs involved. You go to see a doctor, there's no extra costs. You go to the hospital, you don't get charged anything. There was a time here in Madrid where you used to get a piece of paper if you had an operation, for example, telling you how much the operation cost, but you don't get that anymore. And I think that they gave you that piece of paper back in the day to show you how expensive an operation was and that you shouldn't take the healthcare system here in this country for granted. They call it here a universal healthcare system, and everybody who lives in Spain, who is a resident in Spain, a Spanish citizen, has access to it whether they are working or not. So if you're unemployed, you still have access to the medical system. If you've just arrived in this country, for example, if you come from a South American country and you get residency, you get access to the health system straight away. And somebody else in another comment asked me if I rate the hospital system here in Spain, and the answer to that is yes. I haven't had a bad experience in a hospital. My son, as I mentioned, had an operation the other day. My girlfriend's had various operations. I've had an operation in the hospital system, and I can only speak highly about the hospital system here or the experience that I have had with it. I have heard complaints, don't get me wrong. People have had bad experiences, of course, because nothing is perfect, but my personal experience with the health system, I can't complain. It can be a little bit confusing if you don't speak the language very well, but that's another incentive that if you're coming to live in Spain or if you're living in Spain, you need to learn the language to be able to communicate with doctors and nurses, people in primary care, and of course if you need to go into the hospital system, you also need to be able to communicate with the people that are going to be operating or taking care of you. So again, fundamental to learn the language. And finally, just a quick note about tourism. I saw that yesterday German tourists were coming back to the Canary Islands. Apparently they've opened up some type of travel corridor again between Germany and the Canaries. The tour operator TUI was the company involved, and yesterday we saw images of Germans arriving in the Canary Islands. Not sure how many flights there were, But good to see that people are going back there, because the peak tourist season for the Canary Islands apparently is just starting. When the rest of Europe gets cold, the Canaries becomes a very, very attractive tourist destination. So no doubt there's lots of Germans looking forward to a holiday in the sun this winter. On that note, I'll start to wrap the video up. Questions and comments, please leave them in the section below. Debate the situation out as you normally do. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. I'll see you in the next one. Hasta luego.